Well, again, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Neil Malek, and this is the Microsoft Excel webinar regarding pivot tables. Specifically, I've already done one webinar about pivot tables that I called Pivot Tables 101, so I'm going to go ahead and call this one Pivot Tables 102. Throughout the course of this session, the phones are currently on mute. You can go to the top of the screen in any meeting and unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask me questions over the phone or over the computer. And if you don't have that capability, you can also use the chat box on the left-hand side of the screen in order to carry on further conversation with me. So we're going to talk about Microsoft Excel and just overview here. Again, my name's Neil, and if you guys want to follow up with me after today's sessions, feel free to email me at neil@nactraining.com. I'm a Microsoft Certified Trainer, Microsoft Certified Technology Specialist, and Microsoft Certified Professional Developer. So with that many certifications, you got to know I know a little bit of what I'm talking about here. I offer a wide range of different sessions in NAC training. I do Microsoft Office and SharePoint. I do Adobe Creative Suite. I do the Google Apps. I do a wide range of different things. And so today's session is about Excel. Next month's session is about being able to use VLOOKUP inside of Microsoft Excel. And then in December, I'm transitioning over to doing a little Visio 101 about creating diagrams and things like that. However, the entire webinar series for 2014 is completely up in the air, so I am going to leave it to you to send me emails requesting different topics. Those topics can be in anything in the Microsoft suite, anything in the Adobe suite, anything in the Google suite, because again, I do all of it. So feel free to let me know what's relevant to you and what's irrelevant. Couple of quick things. First of all, I did say just a moment ago that this would be posted on YouTube after today's session is over. My YouTube channel can be found at youtube.com/Neil Malek. And what you'll find there is that I periodically will put up training files regarding Excel, Outlook, PowerPoint, basically the whole gamut of things that I teach. I'm in the middle actually of creating a Microsoft Excel 2013 manual, and as part of that manual you'll find that I'm going to be putting up lots of little snippets about Excel 2013 on YouTube. So if you're trying to teach yourself Excel, for example, you'll find a ton of different material up there over the coming 6 months or so. Now, besides the YouTube channel, there is one other thing. During the course of this session, I will be referencing materials and a file specifically. And if you want to download that file, you can go to the address that's on the screen right now. The address is bit.ly/ and then after the slash, it's a capital P, a capital T, and a capital E in Pivot Table Exercise. You'll see that on there's a download file that you can use, and in fact I'll be using the first few tabs of that file. If you proceed to the end of that file, you'll see little exercises that you can do after this session is over to see if you've got the handle on these skills. And of course, you can use the email address that was on my screen a moment ago in order to send me follow-ups and ask me questions about that if you have troubles executing the various different exercises that are in that session. So again, bit.ly/capital P pivot, capital T table, capital E exercise. And what you'll find there is it automatically downloads an Excel 2010 file for you that has the exercises that I'm going to be talking about in this session. I'll leave that up there for about another 15 seconds or so that you guys can copy that down and download those files at your leisure. But this session is primarily about demonstration, so I'd ask you to follow along with what I'm doing, but primarily focus on seeing exactly how and why I'm doing the steps that I'm doing, and then go ahead and follow up after the session, maybe watch the YouTube video and try to repeat the steps again. Okay. Oh, excuse me. And finally, here's what we're going to do in today's session. We're going to review the basic creation of a pivot table, why you would create a pivot table, and what exactly happens when you do. And then what we'll do is we'll go into it, we'll make sure that you're comfortable with changing the calculations to other options, being able to have multiple entries in the row fields, the column fields, and the value area, be able to filter in 3 different ways in your data, and then ultimately do something a little bit exciting here. We're going to create a new calculated field, which is to say that if we have a column for profit, for example, but we don't have a column for profit and we need one, we might actually be able to calculate that field and have it represented even if the original data didn't have it in there. Okay, so that's where we're headed. Let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to open up the Excel file that we're referencing in today's session and begin talking through this. Before I do jump in, I just want to go ahead and check the chat. Does anybody have any questions? Anything that you weren't able to catch on the way through? Lovely. So the whole idea behind a pivot table, for those of you who weren't on the Pivot Table 101 session, is that if you look at something like the Software Purchases tab of my Excel file, you'll find there's a lot of information in here, but very little insight. So for example, I can see all the different customers that we've been dealing with. I can see what they've been buying. I can see how much it costs them. I can see all those pieces of information. However, I cannot, with my own, limited mental capabilities, look at this and find things like the average cost per product, or find things like how much in total commissions we're paying to the different salespeople. That information really isn't here. I can create functions that allow me to do that, but ultimately I'd like to be able to take a table that looks like this and turn it into a much smaller table that looks like this, where it's maybe different data that you can see between these two, but what you can clearly tell is across the top of the screen that we have a simple quarter 1, 2, 3, and 4. Down the left side of the screen we have simple regions like North America, Europe, and Asia. Whereas in our software purchases, we have every purchase on every single day, and we have every single customer and every single sale that they had broken out across the entirety of this table. So what we need to do is we need to summarize this data into a pivot table. To create a pivot table, we click on the data, anywhere at all in the data, and if you're in Excel 2007, 2010, or 2013, you'll see that you have an Insert tab up at the top of the screen that has a Pivot Table button on the far left-hand side. If you're in Excel 2003, you'll go to the Data menu, and you'll notice that Pivot Table is there inside the Data menu. Here I go to the Pivot Table button. It opens up a dialog box that asks me the question whether I've got all the data selected that I want to create a pivot table from. And secondly, it asks me the question, do I want to put this on a brand new worksheet or do I want to put it into a worksheet that already exists? I'll go ahead and choose brand new worksheet and click OK. And you'll see that I have now an empty space where I might decide to build something that looked like the column charts tab. Again, I can see by this illustration here on the left that it's actually expecting me to create something that looks an awful lot like what I saw when I was on the column charts tab. And it's just a matter of being able to pick out the right elements to show in this part of the screen, in this part of the screen, and in this part of the screen. Now in the center part of the screen, we recognize that these are dollar values, things to be calculated, fairly easy there. And across the top of the screen and down the left side of the screen, we see that there are large categories. We don't see every single date, but we do see the first quarter. We don't see every single city in North America. Instead, we see all of North America and all of Europe condensed down by continent. So in the same way, when I go to create a pivot table from my original data, I don't use the individual dates to break down my data. Instead, I find things that are category based. So going back to the original data, I'll see things like, well, there's my salesperson, or there is my type of customer. And those might be relevant things to have on the left side of a pivot table or across the top of a pivot table. As I'm creating a new pivot table, what I do is I look at these 3 boxes in the bottom right-hand corner: the columns area, the rows area, and the values box. Columns and rows are about the vertical representation and the horizontal representation on this screen, and the values are what gets calculated. So let's do the calculation first. Let's say that I wanted to find what the grand total of all the commissions were. If I drag the commission field from the field list, I can click and drag that over into the values box and let go. And immediately upon dropping something that is a dollar amount into the values box, I see that the pivot table actually creates for me a summary where it's calculating the total commission rates. All that's left now is to break this down so it's not just the total commission rates, but perhaps it's the commission rates per salesperson. Now, if I were going to drag the salesperson's name into one of these fields over here at the bottom, so again, I'm taking salesperson name and I'm either putting it into the columns box or I'm putting it into the rows box. What I'll find is that essentially it's the same thing. If I drag salesperson name into the columns box, across the top I'll see all three salespeople. If I drag it into the row box, down the left-hand side, I'll see all three people. But ultimately the breakdown will be the same, simply one's vertical and one's horizontal. So I'll drag salesperson name to the columns box and let go. And here you can see if you drag salesperson name into the column area, you still have the grand total of all the commissions. But here across the top, you have each of the different salespeople. And now I'm going to back up and do the exact same thing, except instead of putting the salesperson name in the column box, I'm going to put it into the row box. And the difference here is simply whether it's across the top or down the left-hand side. I drag salesperson name over to the rows box and let go, and I can see that that table now has all of the salespeople's names running vertically. But again, the commission rates are still being calculated in the same way. And that's our review from Pivot Tables 101. Being able to create a pivot table in the first place, understand what you're trying to accomplish, and then ultimately create a simple pivot table by dragging the appropriate elements into the values box, and then to either or both the columns and the rows areas. Columns and rows are interchangeable. We don't have to worry about which is which here, because ultimately it's just a matter of whether it goes horizontally or vertically. But into the values box goes everything that gets calculated. So I'm going to stop here for a second, check in on you guys. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody need any clarification about what we've done so far? Okay. So what I'll do now is I'll click over on the next tab over for my employee information and repeat the same basic premise. In my employee information, I see that I can do something like click on the data, click on Insert at the top of the screen and choose Pivot Table, and click OK. And now what I might want to be able to find is, based off of each state, how much in salary we're paying out. So I'll grab the state field and drag it over to the rows box and let go. And I'll drag the salary box over to values. And there you can see that in total salary, we're paying out to California this amount of money, and to Colorado this amount of money. I may want to click on where it says the sum of the salary at the bottom and click on Value Field Settings in order to change this. In fact, let's say go to number format here, for example. When I click on number format, you'll see that I can choose currency to format this a bit and make it a little bit prettier. Click OK and click OK. And there's a bit better representation of the same values. So again, in order to format that salary that you just added up down here in the bottom corner, what you do is you click where it says the sum of the salary, and you just ask it to do different things with that by clicking on Value Field Settings. Here, when I went to Value Field Settings, I chose to click on Number Format and went to the Currency option. But you can see other things that I can do. For example, I can click on the Average option here in the middle of my Value Field Settings, click OK, and find the average salary that I'm paying to each of these different regions. Now, once I'm doing an average, I might click on the values box again, click on value field settings again, and change it to average salary. So here I've typed into the custom name box something new. Hit OK. And that's maybe a nicer way of doing things. But here, if I'm looking at the difference between $87,000 and $89,000, I may have a hard time mentally comparing these two numbers against one another. So it may actually be better for me to show these as percentages. So when I go to the bottom of the screen and click on the average salary in the bottom right-hand corner and choose value field settings, besides the ability to change from average of salary to average salary, and the ability to change from sum to average, and I'm going to go ahead and click back to sum, and I'm going to call this one total salary. Ultimately, representing these numbers as dollar amounts may not be the easiest way to analyze the data. And so there is a tab here called Show Values As. And what you'll find on the Show Values As tab is that if you click the drop-down menu for Show Values As, there's this option right here that says a percent of the grand total. Now this is available in Excel 2003, 2007, and 2010. But in older versions of the software, you'll find on that same drop-down menu, you'll have to scroll down a little bit further to be able to see percent of total instead of percent of grand total up towards the top like it is on my version of Excel. But ultimately, they're the same thing. If I choose a percent of the grand total now, I can choose to name this, instead of total salary, something like percent of total salary. And now, when I look at this, I see that instead of showing me raw numbers, raw dollar amounts for how much we're paying to California and how much we're paying to Colorado, now it's represented as percentages, and I can much more easily compare these two against one another. So again, when we click on the values box in the bottom right-hand corner and click on value field settings, some of the more standard things we can do are either sum or average the values, represent them as dollar amounts, and name them something nice. But if I go over here to Show Values As, I can now go in and tell it to show it as a percentage of the grand total instead of just as a dollar amount. And that represents perhaps a better way of looking at the same data. Was everybody able to follow that? Does anybody have any questions, troubles, or curiosities? Looking good. All right, so here we are back at our original pivot table. We're showing things like the percentage of the total salary, and we may find ourselves saying, okay, I like the dollar amount a little bit, and I like the percentage a little bit. It would be nice to be able to show both of them in the same area. Aha. So I think Christine is actually asking the question, the question I was just about to answer. Excellent. Both pieces of data. So there you go. So here's where we're going to go with this. In order to add both pieces of data, all we do, and here's the interesting part, what I'm thinking of is the percent of the total salary, and then also maybe even just the total salary, and then maybe the average salary side by side by side. I can drag multiple different columns into this box, or I can drag the same column into this box multiple times. So as I drag salary into the values box again and let go, here is my sum of the salary next to my percent of the total salary. Again, I'll click where it says sum of salary and choose value field settings and just call this one total salary paid. And then maybe format this up as a dollar amount. Click OK and click OK. All right, so now side by side for California and Colorado, I have the total salary paid out to each of these and the percent of the total salary that those represent, which could be a nicer way of showing the same information. Let's do this again. I'll drag salary in, let go, click where it says the sum of the salary again, choose value field settings, and change this to an average salary. Format that up as a dollar amount again. Okay, so now for California and Colorado, I have the average salary, the total salary paid, and the percent of the total salary. Let's do one more just to have some fun with this. Let's say that I look at this. I say to myself, okay, so the average salary in Colorado is $89,000, but the total salary paid is only 3.6. I wonder how many people that represents for California and Colorado. In order to do a count, you can drag legitimately any column that you want into the values box. So let's say, for example, I drag their last names in. I'm going to drag last name into the value box and let go. And there it is. So I can do the count of how many employees we have. Click on that, click value field settings again, and call this one count, let's say head count. And so now I've got the head count, I've got the average salary and the total salary paid and the percentage that it represents all in the same table together, nicely formatted. The way we're getting this, again, is by using a count, by using an average, by using a total, and by representing that as a percentage value. Excellent. All right, so Christine, anybody else? Do you guys have other questions that you're curious about whether this can do or not? Excellent. So you guys are making connections across this. This is awesome. All right, now this actually brings to mind another thing that you can do with this. So if I look back at the original data, you'll see that besides the state that everybody works in, I also have in here the different offices within those states that they work. So what I can do is I can not only drag multiple elements into the values box, which you've now seen, but I can also drag multiple elements into the rows box. So under state, I have different offices where people work. What I can do is I can drag their offices underneath the state and let go, just like that. So everybody see how that worked? I just dragged office from up there down to here underneath state. And you see the benefit that this gives me? Now I can see that in Durango, I have an office with only 3 employees. Now I can see in San Mateo, California, I have an office with 99 employees, and I can see all sorts of information about these things. I can see that the 3 employees who work in Durango all make a lot of money. I can see that as a percentage of the total salary, the headquarters in San Mateo represents just over half of my total salary paid. And I can also see that LA is obviously a pretty big office in terms of the head count and in terms of the salary paid to them. So again, what I've got here is this original data where I've got one category that then has sort of a sub breakdown underneath that. Let's go ahead and see that in another situation. Here on my real estate sales tab, I have a property type for residential and commercial, and then within that, a property subtype for the different types of properties. So when I create a pivot table from this, again, clicking on Insert, choosing Pivot Table, and clicking OK, I can now drag not only the property type into the rows box, but also the property subtype into the rows box, thereby giving me a breakdown in my pivot table by each of the different commercial types and each of the different residential types. And then I can do something like drag the sale price, for example, into the value box, and again, format that up. And there you go. So because you can put multiple elements in the value box and the row box and the column box, you have a lot of flexibility here for creating some very, very robust pivot tables. Now what I'm going to do is show you guys that you can actually do filtering in a variety of different ways as well. So we've got this original pivot table, and we've got a variety of different calculations and breakdowns within here. If I go to the row labels drop-down menu, you'll notice that within the row labels drop-down menu, I've got the ability to filter this down to show either the commercial properties or the residential properties. And in the same way, on my previous pivot table, I can use the row labels drop-down menu to show either California or Colorado. Or in the software purchases, I've got the ability to click the drop-down menu and filter out any of the existing salespeople that I don't need to see right now. So I can click the drop-down menu, tell this that I don't want to currently see any of the employees who work in Colorado, and hit OK. And now I've just got the subset of data here. I can see that the percentages have shifted. If I'm curious about just the total amount of salary paid in California and what the percentages are as a ratio of that, I can see that San Mateo represents a 69% chunk of the total salary paid to the state of California. So I can use those drop-down menus to filter this data, but I can also use what's called the pivot table filter list. So here, this field has the ability to contain things that I might want to filter by. For example, I may want to drag the department column into the filters box and filter by what department everybody works in. Drag department into the filters box. I can see now that there's a drop-down menu on that filter box. And I have the ability to say, show me the employees for information technology. Hit OK. And you can see the subset of data for those employees who work in IT for each of the different regions. And again, drop-down menu, admin staff, click OK. And I can see the count of admin staff in each of these different offices. I can see the average salary and the total salary for each of the admin staff. Human resources. And so by using the filters area, I have this ability to create subsets of data in my pivot table, which is rather nice. But ultimately, this pivot table filter list is good, but maybe not great enough. Here's the one idea that I have for you guys. When you're creating pivot tables based off the employees list, for example, you may not only want the simple pivot table here with this set of data, but you may want another pivot table next to it. So for example, I may want to go to the employees spreadsheet, click on the original data again, click on Insert at the top of the screen and click Pivot Table. And this time, instead of putting that second pivot table into a brand new worksheet, I'm going to click on the existing worksheet option and go to Sheet 2 and put this new worksheet, put this new pivot table in the same worksheet alongside the first. So here I've got Pivot Table 1 on the left, Pivot Table 2 on the right. And now I may want to drag in the department column into the rows box and the salary into the values box. So here I've got two pivot tables side by side, one for breakdown by region, the other one for breakdown by department. Or I may want to go to a pivot table like this one for my real estate and say, okay, I've got a pivot table based off of, oops. Here we go. I've already got a pivot table based off of the types of properties, but now I may want a pivot table based off the agents who are selling the properties. So again, I'm just dragging the appropriate information into the rows and values boxes and creating pivot tables side by side that both give us interesting and valuable information. So now I know, based off of the types of properties and based off of who the salespeople are, what the total amount that we're selling happens to be. But what I don't see is I don't see this broken down by region. Now you can see that over here in my field list on the right-hand side, I do in fact keep track of the region that each of these sales is being made in. And I may want to filter both pivot tables simultaneously so that I don't see all of the different totals for the different types of properties and all of the different totals for the different salespeople, but rather only those sales that were made in North America or only those sales that were made in Europe. In order to do this, we cannot use the filter list. The filter list down here in the corner is not going to work for our situation because the filter list cannot do two different pivot tables simultaneously. Instead, what we need to do, and this is available to Excel 2010 and 2013, is we need to insert what's called a slicer into that pivot table. A slicer is just like a filter, except it's useful for two or more pivot tables at the same time. So I click on Insert Slicer up at the top of the screen. I tell it that I want to filter that information by what region everybody works in, and click OK. And then I make sure that that pivot table filter is connected to both pivot tables at the same time by clicking on Report Connections up at the top of the screen and making sure that both checkboxes are checked. When I hit OK, I can now see that if I click on Eastern, for example, both of these tables filter down and show me the different quantities that are being sold in each of the different regions. So a pivot table creates a summary of our original data. It allows us to create a variety of different calculations. You've now seen me do counts, averages, totals, and percentages as we move through this data. And we can create as many different pivot tables broken down by as many different types of information as we want. But if we create more than one pivot table, in order to filter that data, what we do is we click on the original data, click on the Analyze or Options tab at the top of the screen, and insert a new slicer. That slicer is a filter that can be applied to both of the pivot tables at the same time. So I choose a type of thing to filter by, make sure that that is connected to both pivot tables simultaneously. And now I can say, show me all of the properties in the Pacific region that were sold to the Hill Group. And I can see the different types of properties, as well as how much was sold by each of the different salespeople. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Pivot Tables 102. Once you create the appropriate pivot table, we need to make sure that it does a variety of different calculations, that it filters the information in a variety of different ways, and that shows us different subsets of data based off of whatever we're looking for. I'm going to stick around and answer any and all questions you might have. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time and energy today, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. And remember, please be amazing at what you do.